The snow fell in dense, relentless flakes over the summit Grand Lodge, transforming the mountainous landscape into a silent, white blanket. Isabella Reyes, a hospitality supervisor at the resort, was reviewing the final details of the presidential suite, oblivious to the fury gathering outside. Her nimble fingers traced the smooth surface of the furniture, checking every detail with the precision of someone who understood the value of impeccable service. She should have been replaced by another colleague for the night's closing, but a last-minute staffing emergency kept her there, an irony of fate that, unbeknownst to her, would change her life forever. Her shift was almost over, and Bella yearned to return to her small house in Silver Creek, Colorado, a cozy, simple refuge, far from the excessive luxury and imposing solitude the lodge commanded. Here, amidst cashmere throws and priceless artworks, she felt like a fish out of water, always with the feeling of merely passing through. However, the storm's true power was underestimated by everyone. The initial forecast for a light snowfall had transformed into an extreme weather event, and the roads connecting the lodge to civilization were already impassable, covered by a thick, insurmountable layer of ice and snow. A sense of unease began to settle in her chest, an uncomfortable premonition that something far greater and more challenging was coming, something completely beyond her control. It was the kind of situation her abuela would say was a real mess. Julian Thorne, for his part, had arrived at the lodge seeking isolation and discretion. For him, this was more than a refuge. It was a temporary fortress, a strategic point to conduct delicate political negotiations, far from the curious eyes and incessant intrigues of his corporate empire. His presence there was a well-kept secret, a measure of security and strategy, and the idea of being disturbed by anything other than the successful conclusion of his plans was unthinkable. Julian, a man of absolute power and control, was accustomed to the world bending to his will, to his commands being law, and to every detail of his life being meticulously orchestrated. But nature, relentless and indifferent to human hierarchy, had its own plans, and they did not include bowing to any CEO. Bella's arrival, a woman completely outside his usual circle, a mere resort employee, was already an anomaly in his rigorous and calculated routine, a small deviation he had ignored. The storm, now roaring outside with the ferocity of a caged lion, was an even greater threat, a direct challenge to his authority and his ability to protect himself and, by extension, his legacy. The roar of the wind outside was suddenly accompanied by a dry crack and an eerie silence. The sudden power outage plunged the summit Grand Lodge into near-total darkness, an oppressive vacuum that swallowed the little light remaining. Only the sound of the wind howled outside, and the silence within the lodge was almost deafening, punctuated only by Bella's ragged breathing. The temperature began to drop rapidly, and the isolation, once a luxury, transformed into a cold, shadowy prison. Bella, with her emergency flashlight in hand, a small, flickering beam of light that seemed to fight against the vastness of the darkness, tried to stay calm. Her heart beat wildly, a frantic drum in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe deeply, to keep her head straight. "It's just a power outage, Bella, it'll pass," she repeated to herself, though the voice of reason sounded faint against the backdrop. The imposing presence of Julian, now visible only as a tall, dark silhouette against the blackness of the room, added a layer of tension to the already oppressive atmosphere. He did not utter a word, but his presence was a weight, an invisible force that hung in the air. Bella felt a shiver run down her spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. It was the awareness of being alone, trapped, with such a powerful and enigmatic man. Her eyes tried to adjust to the gloom, seeking any hint of expression on Julian's face, but the darkness was an impenetrable veil. She knew he was watching her. She felt the weight of his gaze even without seeing him. What would a man accustomed to having everything, to controlling empires, do when confronted with the most basic of human needs, survival in a hostile and unforgiving environment? And how would an ordinary woman, pragmatic and independent but without any power or influence, react to such an extreme situation beside a leader so powerful, so distant from her world? The stage was set for a night that would defy all expectations, that would break every barrier, and that, for Bella, seemed more like a primetime soap opera script than her actual life. The air grew denser, charged with a silent electricity, foreshadowing an inevitable collision between two worlds and two souls, now united by the cruel caprice of a storm. The icy air, once merely a forewarning, began to fiercely bite at the walls of the Summit Grand Lodge, transforming what was opulence into an increasingly cold and hostile trap. Isabella Reyes, or Bella, accustomed to handling unforeseen events in her resort role, and with a resilience forged in her own life, acted with an almost instinctive promptness. Her fingers, already somewhat numb, fumbled with the stacked firewood next to the fireplace, feeling the penetrating dampness that rendered it unsuitable for lighting a proper fire. She tried anyway, with bits of paper and thin twigs, but the sparse smoke that emerged was more a lament than a promise of warmth. The electric heating system, silenced by the storm, was merely a memory of comfort that now seemed an unattainable luxury, as distant as the sun that had vanished beneath the white fury outside, Julian Thorne observed. Initially his mind was consumed by the abrupt interruption to his schedule, by the inconvenience of being stranded in such an isolated locale, far from his Thorne Enterprises empire and his myriad responsibilities. He, a CEO accustomed to absolute control, saw Bella as a secondary character in his universe, an employee whose role was to serve, not to challenge, or even less, to share such an intimate emergency. There was a latent impatience in his demeanor, yet also a burgeoning curiosity. He had never witnessed anyone so pragmatic and, simultaneously, so visibly shaken by circumstances. Adrenaline, an old companion in moments of corporate takeover battles or market crises, began to pulse through his veins, but now with a different flavor, more visceral, more primitive. It was not the peril of a coup or a rebellion, but nature's silent, relentless threat. His calculating gaze, trained to assess complex scenarios and make drastic decisions, swept across the lodge, measuring the visibly plummeting temperature, the ineffectiveness of Bella's efforts, the inevitability of a situation rapidly turning fatal. Hypothermia was an invisible yet real enemy, and survival, for a man who bore the weight of an empire on his shoulders, was the only conceivable option. Social rules, decorum, the chasm of status, all of it began to crumble before life's raw urgency. It was then that Julian Thorne's grave, authoritative voice sliced through the thin air of the lodge, not as a request, but as a proclamation, an order that brooked no argument. "Miss Reyes," he began, his imposing silhouette against the gloom, his eyes, though barely visible in the dark, seeming to pierce Bella's very soul. "The situation demands drastic measures. To retain warmth and ensure our survival until rescue, you will have to share your body with me." The phrase, uttered with a coldness bordering on cruelty, yet cloaked in an implacable logic, struck Bella like a physical blow. Not just the cold, but an icy dread coursed through her veins, a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Share her body? That audacity, that sheer nerve, was something she, a woman of Latina heritage, accustomed to fighting for her place and her dignity, would never have imagined hearing. Her wounded pride screamed in protest, and the independence she so cherished rose in her defense. "What? How dare you?" she shot back, her voice choked with fury and shock. "That's preposterous. Isn't there any other way?" She confronted him, questioning not just the morality of such an act, but its very necessity. There had to be other solutions, she insisted, even if she couldn't conjure a single one in that moment. But Julian's cold logic was impenetrable. He explained the risks of hypothermia with a scientist's precision, detailing how the body shed heat, the inevitability of freezing without a sustained external or internal heat source. He cited the scarcity of blankets, the ineffectiveness of her attempts to light the fireplace, the unlikelihood of a swift rescue. He wasn't offering a negotiable proposal, but an imperative demand, presented as the sole logical and inevitable solution for survival under such extreme conditions. With each word, Bella's resistance was eroded, not by persuasion, but by the brute force of reason and necessity. Bella's vulnerability, the primal fear of freezing to death, the overwhelming realization that in fact there was no other viable option, led her to a pragmatic, yet agonizing decision. She conceded not out of desire, not out of attraction, but out of an instinctive, desperate need to live. It was a bitter surrender, a sacrifice imposed by the cruel hand of fate and by Julian Thorne's unquestionable authority. This moment marked the genesis of a dangerously complex dynamic, where the line between survival and seduction, between imposition and acceptance, became perilously thin, almost invisible in the burgeoning darkness. The gloom of the Summit Grand Lodge, which once was merely the absence of light and the promise of tranquil slumber, now became a veil for a forced intimacy, where conventions would be irremediably shattered and emotions inevitably ignited into a fire that no cold could ever extinguish. With every snowflake that hit the window of the Summit Grand Lodge, a new layer of isolation formed, not only between them and the outside world, but also between the facades Julian and Bella were forced to maintain. The darkness, dense and almost palpable, that swallowed the powerless lodge's interior paradoxically, clarified the invisible barriers separating them. What began as Julian Thorne's raw, pragmatic proposal to keep warm, a survival imperative dictated by adrenaline and the biting cold, rapidly unfolded into much more complex and dangerous territory. The first touches, hesitant and calculated, were merely a dance of bodies seeking comfort, but with each shared breath in the oppressive silence, physical necessity gave way to a deeper curiosity, a tacit recognition of each other's humanity. Julian Thorne, accustomed to a world where everything was transaction and control, where women were pawns in a political game or ephemeral sources of pleasure, found in Isabella Reyes a resistance and authenticity that disarmed him. The calculating coldness he cultivated as a shield, a legacy of past losses, and the overwhelming responsibility of his corporate empire, began to crack under her perceptive gaze, even in the dimness. It wasn't just Bella's body that attracted him, but the silent strength emanating from her, the resilience he saw in her eyes, the intelligence shining through her pragmatic and at times challenging responses. That resort employee, who should have been nothing more than a shadow, became an inescapable presence, an unexpected light in his world of shadows and duties. He could no longer see her as just an object. She was a challenge, an enigma he desired to unravel. For Bella, the initial humiliation of Julian's proposition, the feeling of being reduced to a means to an end, gave way to a growing confusion. Julian Thorne, whom she had imagined a cold, distant tyrant, revealed himself in layers like the mountains surrounding them. In their forced isolation, stripped of his entourage, his luxuries, and his apparent power, he was just a man, still imposing, yet strangely vulnerable. His touches, initially firm and authoritative, softened, transforming into exploratory caresses that ignited an undeniable electricity within her. The fear that had once paralyzed her yielded to a powerful, almost hypnotic attraction. She found herself not just yielding, but responding, her own skin prickling under his fingers, her body reacting to a chemistry that transcended all logic or prejudice. In the silence broken only by the wind's howl and the distant crackle of wood, words began to emerge, whispered like secrets in an impromptu confessional. Julian, surprising himself, spoke of the crushing weight of his responsibilities, the inherent loneliness of power that isolated him from genuine connections, the painful loss that shaped his skepticism toward love. He revealed to Bella the burden of being a thorn, of holding the fate of an empire in his hands, of having his entire life mapped out by political conveniences, including his engagement to Genevieve Sterling, a reality he had never questioned until this very moment. Bella, in turn, opened her heart about the hardships of her life, the constant fight for independence, the wounded pride that prevented her from blindly trusting authority figures, especially those with as much power as Julian. She spoke of the need to figure things out and never back down, values deeply rooted in her family's heritage, having taught her to be resourceful and resilient. Each revelation was a brick removed from a wall, each touch a spark in a latent fire. The chemistry between them wasn't merely physical, it was an explosion of souls, a passion manifesting not just in their intertwined bodies, but in minds that met and recognized each other. Julian's desire to possess Bella transcended the merely carnal. He wanted the whole woman, her vibrant heart, her keen mind, her untamed soul. And Bella, despite all her principles and the reasons screaming at her to flee, felt herself dragged into an abyss of emotions, a maelstrom consuming her from within. The passion engulfing them was one of those straight out of a cheesy script kind, intense, forbidden, and utterly overwhelming, seeming to defy fate itself. The storm outside continued to rage with relentless fury, covering the world in a white, frozen shroud. But inside the Summit Grand Lodge, a far more intense emotional tempest was unfolding, a hurricane of desire and vulnerability promising to forever alter the course of their lives. In that isolated refuge, stripped of their masks and social conventions, Julian and Bella were being remade, fused in a fire that no cold could extinguish. The next morning would not find them the same. They were irrevocably connected. The first morning light squeezed through the frosted panes of the Summit Grand Lodge, painting a picture of icy destruction outside. Fallen trees, snowdrifts nearly swallowing the structure whole, a heavy silence only nature at rest can truly offer. Inside, however, the landscape had been redrawn in a far more intimate and complex way. The silence that had previously dragged on, oppressive and full of uncertainty, now seemed to pulse with a different energy, laden with newly shared secrets and a complicity forged in the most extreme adversity. The initial awkwardness, inevitable after the night's intensity, began to give way to a strange familiarity, almost a natural extension of one another. Both felt the magnitude of what had transpired within the walls of that isolated refuge, an experience that had marked them profoundly in every fibre of their souls. Julian Thorne, accustomed to a life of iron-fisted control over his empire and his own emotions, felt strangely unsettled. It wasn't the chaos of the storm that shook him, but the internal tempest that Isabella Reyes had awakened. He who believed he had buried every trace of vulnerability beneath layers of duty and responsibility to his family and Thorne Enterprises, now found himself confronted with a torrent of feelings. The physical attraction was undeniable, a fire he had never before experienced with such veracity. But it was far more than that. It was Bella's perceptive intelligence, her unwavering resilience in the face of danger and adversity, her purity of spirit that captivated him in a way he had never imagined possible. She was not one of the women of his court in East Hampton, educated for submission and grace, but a force of nature, a woman with that intrinsic fight in her, challenging and fascinating him simultaneously. He found himself re-evaluating every aspect of his life, his priorities, the future he had charted for himself and his empire. The promise to Genevieve Sterling, once an unshakable pillar of his existence and corporate stability, now seemed fragile, almost meaningless before the intensity Bella had ignited in his chest. Julian, the unshakable CEO, was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely confused and at the same time strangely determined not to lose what he had found. Bella, for her part, was immersed in an emotional whirlwind that left her breathless. The night with Julian had been a complex and overwhelming blend. There had been the initial fear, the pragmatic resignation in the face of death by cold, but to her own surprise and consternation, there was also an undeniable wild passion that caught her completely off guard. She felt vulnerable, exposed to her deepest essence, as if every secret of her soul had been laid bare under Julian's penetrating gaze. Yet, amidst this vulnerability, a new strength seemed to have been born within her, a resilience that went beyond mere survival. The experience made her question her own beliefs about love, power, destiny, and the very life she led. She, a dedicated hospitality supervisor at a luxury resort with modest dreams and a life guided by independence, had given herself to a billionaire CEO, a man from a world as distant from hers as the desert is from the top of that mountain. She knew, with the clarity of consciousness that arises after a shock, that her world and Julian's were incompatible, like oil and water, like sand and snow. But the connection they had forged in the dark, in the urgency of survival, was real, palpable, and burned in her memory with an intensity that both frightened and attracted her. This was truly like something out of a bad rom-com movie, a primetime soap opera plot, something that would never happen in real life, and yet there she was, living every second, feeling that life suddenly had far more color and danger than she had ever imagined. As they tried to navigate this new and complex dynamic, the first signs of rescue began to emerge on the horizon, the distant yet unmistakable sound of helicopters cutting through the heavy morning air, followed by the frantic movement of search teams approaching the summit Grand Lodge, brought a wave of almost euphoric relief. The threat of the storm had passed. Life was returning to normal, but along with the relief came a sharp pang of apprehension, a knot in Bella's throat. The end of isolation meant a return to reality, to the relentless social hierarchy, and to the impassable chasm that separated them. She mentally prepared to go back to her ordinary life, to the resort routine, with the memory of that night etched in her soul as if by fire, a scar, perhaps, or a secret treasure that would accompany her forever, a secret all her own. Julian, the man who had demanded her body for body heat, was now the man who had seen her soul and stirred her deepest foundations. But Julian Thorne had other plans, plans he was beginning to formulate with the unwavering determination of a CEO accustomed to getting everything he desired. He watched her, his dark eyes fixed on her with an almost possessive intensity. There was no hesitation in his gaze, only the cold certainty that she would not escape. The snowstorm had ended, yes, but the real tempest in their lives was only just beginning. He was not willing to let her go so easily, to see her vanish from his world like a fleeting dream. The decision was made, as firm and non-negotiable as the Wall Street skyscrapers he commanded, as solid as the mountains that had isolated them. Bella was his, and he would move heaven and earth to keep her by his side, whatever the cost, challenging traditions or the corporate court. She was the fire he didn't know he needed, and he wouldn't let her go for anything in this world. The roar of search engines and the blare of rescue sirens tore through the mountain's quiet, each sound piercing the silence that had been an accomplice to secrets and touches. Bella felt a mix of relief and a strange, almost painful, melancholy. It was the end of the physical ordeal, but also the harbinger of a farewell she, deep down, already expected. She mentally prepared to return to her simple life, to the resort routine, certain that the night spent with Julian Thorne would be an intense memory, a wildfire, yet isolated in her past. It was a story she would only tell herself, perhaps to a diary kept under 7 locks. Yet Julian Thorne did not share her perspective. As Bella took her first hesitant steps toward the rescue team, an overwhelming wave of possessiveness washed over him. It wasn't merely desire. It was a visceral conviction. The thought of simply letting her vanish from his life, of seeing her return to her ordinary existence, was unbearable. The connection they had forged under the blizzard's threat, the way she had awakened something in his soul he hadn't even known existed, was a treasure he wasn't willing to relinquish. It was as if, having tasted that warmth, he could no longer conceive of life in the cold. With the authority that emanated from every pore of his being, and an influence that stretched far beyond those icy mountains, Julian intervened. His step was firm, his voice an irrefutable command. He did not allow Bella to leave. Under the pretext of a debt of honor, after all, she had, in a way, saved his sanity, or personal security. Claiming she had witnessed his vulnerability, he hired her. The term was a formality, a mere veneer for what was, in reality, a demand. She was to accompany him, not to an ancient emirate, but to the Thorne Enterprises headquarters in Manhattan, or to the Thorne estate in East Hampton, under his protection, of course, but undeniably under his control. Bella felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. That proposal, which seemed more like an imposition, was a direct blow to her hard-won independence. She protested, her voice choked with disbelief and suppressed anger. "I don't belong in your world, Julian Thorne. I have my life, my freedom, my roots here in Colorado," she argued, her eyes sparking with the same intensity as his. But Julian's willpower was an unshakable wall, and his ability to manipulate circumstances, to weave a web of obligations and appeals, was impressive. He convinced her, or forced her, to accept, appealing to a sense of responsibility she somehow felt for what had transpired between them. And perhaps deep in her heart, there was a veiled curiosity, a secret yearning to uncover what that uncertain future might truly hold. It was a mix of resignation and a tiny spark of adventure, as if she were about to bungee jump without a cord, knowing it was madness, but unable to resist the impulse. Thus, like something out of a cheesy primetime soap opera script, Bella found herself boarding a private jet, a luxurious aircraft that contrasted absurdly with the simplicity of her life until then. The destination was a world of opulence and entrenched old money traditions, something she only knew from movie screens or gossip magazines. The journey was a blur of luxury and apprehension, each minute taking her further from everything familiar. The arrival in Julian's world was an overwhelming class shock, a punch to the gut of her reality. The sprawling estates and gleaming penthouses, more lavish than anything she could imagine, shone under the urban sun, reflecting an almost obscene wealth. The impeccably tailored suits, the haute couture gowns that adorned the elite, the murmur of corporate jargon and hushed social codes she didn't comprehend, the rigid social rules, seemingly dictated by centuries of old money history, and the curious, often judging stares of the inner circle made her feel smaller than a speck of dust in this gilded cage. She was an outsider, an unsuspecting intruder in a universe where every gesture, every word, held a profound and often hidden meaning. It was as if she had dropped into a black-tie gala, wearing flip-flops and a band T-shirt. Julian, now back on his corporate throne, clad in his bespoke suits and radiating unquestionable authority, was the CEO, the supreme leader. The distance between them seemed wider than ever, an unbridgeable chasm opening between the man who had touched her and the formidable executive he was. The warmth of the lodge had been replaced by the cold formalism of this corporate royalty. To complete this tense tableau, the presence of Genevieve Sterling, Julian's promised fiancée, added a glacial layer to the atmosphere. Genevieve, with her imposing beauty and haughty gaze, made it clear, without needing a single word, that Bella was unwelcome and that her place in this privileged world was precarious, an affront to the old money traditions and the Thorne family's honor. The forced coexistence had begun, but now on a much larger stage, with spotlights pointed at every move and stakes much, much higher. The opulent world of the Thorne estate in East Hampton, and indeed, Manhattan's elite circles, swallowed Bella Reyes like a tidal wave, a stark contrast to the silent Colorado snow. Every grand hall of the Thorne family's palatial estate exuded centuries of history, a weight of tradition that threatened to crush her very existence. Far from the isolation that had forged an unexpected intimacy, this social court was a vibrant, yet hostile, stage where her presence, a woman from a different world without their old money pedigree or lineage, was met with a mix of veiled curiosity and thinly disguised disdain. She felt the searing stares on her back, whispers in the coded language of privilege that she still didn't completely grasp, but whose intent was unequivocally clear. She didn't belong here. The society women, draped in designer silks and glittering jewels, observed her like an anomaly. Their smiles were as thin as razor blades, their questions about her background and her connection to Julian, disguised as courtesy, were in truth cruel probings. Bella, with her resilience forged in real life and not in the cushioned world of inherited wealth, felt every blow. Her inner strength, however, would not let her bend. Genevieve Sterling, Julian's promised fiancée, personified this resistance. Genevieve was the embodiment of elegance and pride. Every one of her movements was calculated, every word a polished arrow. She approached Bella with a false courtesy that barely concealed the determination in her dark eyes. For Genevieve, Bella was not just a rival, but an affront to her honor, and to the stability of the Thorne empire she was raised to help govern alongside Julian. She wasn't some cheap soap opera villain, but a woman driven by an unshakable sense of duty and tradition, trained since childhood to be the Thorne matriarch, the mother of his heirs. The very idea that an outsider could destabilize everything she represented was simply unbearable. Julian, for his part, was visibly torn. He tried to shield Bella from the gossip and social traps, but his actions were a tangle of contradictions. He kept her close, assigning her tasks that kept her in his orbit, as if her mere presence were a balm for his tormented soul. Yet, he could not openly defy the traditions of his old money circle without risking his authority. his very corporate crown. The pressure to marry Genevieve and secure a legitimate heir was a heavy burden, an expectation Bella felt hanging over them like a sword. She found herself trapped in a golden cage, where the opulence suffocated her freedom and individuality, its ancient rules threatening to erase who she was. It was like being on some reality TV show, but with far more at stake and no chance of being voted off. Each day, Bella waged a silent battle to maintain her identity. She refused to completely bow to expectations, questioning the traditions with a sharp intelligence and displaying a resilience that would make her abuela proud. This stance, though it irritated many who expected submission, also began to spark admiration from a few members of the inner circle, and, more importantly, from Julian himself. He observed, almost secretly, how she navigated that strange world, and the strength she demonstrated only made her more attractive to him, a flame he couldn't extinguish. The cultural clash was palpable, the conflict between her world of humble roots and his old money dynasty, between tradition and modernity, manifesting in the growing tension between Bella and this court of privilege. She realized she wasn't just a guest, but a key player in a much larger game of power, where her heart and her future were at stake. Weeks turned into months, and the gravity of Bella's situation deepened. She felt increasingly isolated, the air of the estate seeming thin under the weight of expectations and judgments. Yet, amidst this turmoil, a new and overwhelming truth began to sprout within her, one that would change the game forever. A slight morning dizziness, a sudden aversion to certain strong smells, unexplained fatigue. Bella, with her innate pragmatism, initially ignored the signs, attributing them to the stress of adaptation. But their persistence forced her to confront a possibility that left her breathless. With her heart beating like a wild hummingbird's wings, she managed, secretly, to get a pregnancy test. The positive result was a shock that shook her to her very soul. A baby, Julian's child, that tiny being, still a promise, was irrefutable proof of the forbidden passion that had united them in the lodge. It was also the time bomb that would detonate the entire Thorne empire. The fear was palpable, but the emotion of a new life pulsing within her was even stronger. She didn't know how Julian would react, how this court would react, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back. The news, when it finally reached Julian's ears, did not come directly from Bella. Marcus Thorne, Julian's uncle and the ambitious board member who coveted control of Thorne Enterprises, had his own spies. He knew even before Bella found the courage to tell. Marcus saw in Bella's pregnancy a golden opportunity to destabilize the CEO, using tradition against him. An outsider, without pedigree, expecting an illegitimate heir, was an unprecedented scandal, a fatal blow to Julian's authority. The court exploded in murmurs and condemnations. Genevieve Sterling, upon hearing the news, felt her honor trampled. Her fury was cold and calculating, but her heart was in pieces. She confronted Julian with wounded dignity, demanding that he repudiate Bella and the bastard child, marrying her to restore order and decency. Marcus, for his part, began to orchestrate a smear campaign, spreading rumors about Bella's immorality and Julian's weakness, seeking to undermine his position and incite a succession crisis. Julian, however, was not a man to be easily manipulated. At first, the shock of the news hit him hard. The weight of old money traditions and his family's expectations oppressing him. But as he looked at Bella, at the vulnerability and strength in her eyes, and as he felt the promise of a new life, something within him changed forever. The calculating coldness that characterized him began to melt, revealing a man who for the first time was willing to fight for his heart, for his family. He convened an extraordinary board meeting, an unprecedented event. The tension was palpable, the looks of disapproval and expectation fixed on Bella and Julian. Marcus Thorne, confident in his victory, was already preparing to launch his accusations. Genevieve Sterling, erect and haughty, awaited Bella's humiliation. But Julian Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Enterprises, surprised everyone. His voice resonated through the boardroom with unquestionable authority, but for the first time with an emotion no one expected. He declared, before the entire board, that Isabella Reyes was the woman of his heart, and that the child she carried in her womb was his legitimate heir. He vehemently rejected Marcus's accusations, calling him a traitor for trying to use family traditions for his own selfish ends. With a decisive move, he stripped Marcus of his board position and banished him from the Thorn inner circle. Genevieve Sterling, shocked, tried to intervene, appealing to Julian's duty. But the CEO interrupted her, his voice firm yet respectful. He thanked her for her loyalty and her honor, but explained that his heart had chosen a different path, a path that could not be denied. He offered Genevieve an honorable agreement, one that would preserve her dignity and that of her family's legacy, but that would release her from their engagement. Genevieve, though wounded, recognized the unshakable determination in Julian's eyes and, with a sigh of defeat and one last look of heartbreak at Bella, accepted. It was the end of one era, the beginning of another. Julian's decision was an earthquake that shook the foundations of the Thorn Enterprises empire. There was resistance, of course, but the CEO's authority was unquestionable. In time, Bella, the outsider, began to be seen in a new light. Her resilience, her intelligence, and above all the joy of their son, who was soon born, began to melt even the hardest hearts. The baby, a healthy and strong boy with the dark eyes of Julian and the vivacity of Bella, was living proof that love could, indeed, transcend social barriers and prejudices. Bella did not become a fairy tale princess, but a Thorn matriarch in her own right, redefining the role of a woman in that gilded cage. She brought a fresh perspective, an open mind that little by little began to influence Julian to modernize some of the more archaic traditions of the old money world, without disrespecting their rich history. The prejudice of the social elite was silenced not only by Julian's authority, but by the undeniable legitimacy of their love and the family they built. Julian and Bella, the CEO and the resort hospitality supervisor, found a love that defied all expectations, one that was born amidst a snowstorm and blossomed amidst the boardroom battles and Hampton's drama. They proved that the heart, when it speaks, can move mountains and tear down prejudices, building a future where love and mutual respect were the most sacred laws. Their story became a legend, a whispered hope in a world that often forgot the power of human connection. And so, the lives of Bella and Julian, which began with a pragmatic proposal of survival, transformed into an epic of love, defiance, and redemption. They built a future together, a future where the strength of a CEO and the resilience of a Latina woman united to create a legacy of love and change. That lodge, once an isolated refuge, was the birthplace of a passion that rewrote the destiny of an empire and of two souls so different, yet so connected. If you're on the edge of your seat with this journey, with Bella's courage and Julian's transformation, don't forget to tune in next week for more heart-stopping drama and share your thoughts on this twist of fate in the comments. Your opinion means the world to us.